Jesus had been very busy during this period of his life as he navigated life around the Sea of Galilee. He would regularly engage with all sorts of people, bring healing to many people, and hope to some. At times during this time in his life, he would speak to large crowds, and people would ask him questions about who he was. And his response caused quite a stir in the towns and cities of the regions. I imagine that there were people talking in the streets, kind of bumping shoulders with each other. Did you hear what happened with Jesus? Did you hear what he said? Who do you think this man is? Well, the religious leaders of the area, they were certainly drawn to Jesus, not from an attractive sense, but rather a position of skepticism and at times hostility. Jesus quoted a particular like a little poem to describe how they would behave. He said this about the religious. He says, "How can I describe them? They're like children playing a game in the public square. They complain to their friends. We played wedding songs, you didn't dance. We played funeral songs, you didn't weep." He pokes fun at them that they're behaving like children who are temperamental, never satisfied. When it's a celebration, you complain that people are happy. When it's a funeral, you complain that people are sad. Either way, the religious leaders complained about Jesus. This is the kind of the background, the setting in the events of a story that I want to tell you today about Jesus. It was at the end of one of these long days, these times when he had been interacting with the people of Galilee, where he was invited to go along to dinner at the home of a Pharisee. Teachers would often be invited for meals. Meals in that environment were considered an appropriate place and time to discuss ideas, to debate thoughts. And Jesus must have had a particular social standing to actually be invited to them. And so on this particular occasion, he's invited to the home of a religious leader, a Pharisee. This wasn't uncommon for Jesus. If you read the gospel accounts of his life, he's often having food with people, isn't he? Sitting down to eat. Not long before, he'd sat down for a meal with a publican. And Jesus had a broad range of people that he would eat with. The meal on this occasion was not a private meal. It wasn't one of those meals in a fancy restaurant, in a private room. No, this meal was held around a very common table of that era. It was one of those sort of like those long, low tables that would accommodate a whole bunch of people. Guests would arrive for the meal and they would remove their shoes and their socks. I'm not going to do it today. They would remove they didn't have shoes and socks, they had sandals. And in that era, on the dusty roads, their feet would be smelly and dirty. They would remove them and they would lie towards the table. Now, sometimes I think about performing this, but I'm not sure that I actually will be able to get up again in an appropriate amount of time. They would lie down where they would have their head be left-handed, close to the table like this, their feet away from the table. They would have cushions underneath them and eat with their other hand. The meal was an open occasion. Since Jesus was a public figure, the public were invited to attend, to hear the discussion. And this is how, on this occasion, an uninvited woman is able to join them. It's probably difficult to imagine in a day like today an uninvited guest interrupting a meal, but that's what happened. The Bible describes her as a certain immoral woman or a sinner. Really, that's a first century euphemism for a prostitute. She'd probably heard the news on the grapevine. And Jesus is having dinner at Simon's house, and she wanted to see Jesus, and nothing was going to get in the way of her doing that. Everyone knew who she was in that town. Unlike here, if a prostitute walked in today, we'd probably not be able to identify her. But in the smaller towns of Middle Eastern culture, everybody would know who the prostitute was. It must have taken great courage for her to enter that home. But she was focused on Jesus, undeterred by the slurs or the opinions of people. As she comes in, she brings with herself an alabaster jar of perfume. It would look much like a modern sort of version of a long-necked vase made of alabaster. It was expensive. It was typically worn around a neck on a string. For a prostitute, it was often left open to perfume her neck and her hair, part of the ply of the trade. But this prostitute no longer needed her perfume for her trade, for she had a different intention: to anoint Jesus with it. And so she enters the house. I'm sure she did so quietly, not wanting to arouse attention, but on the other hand, not wanting to be distracted from the task that she had set herself on this occasion. From the edges of the room, you can imagine this kind of out of the spotlight, she emerges. She approaches Jesus. It's not coincidental that the text tells us that she approaches us from his feet. In that culture, feet are considered very lowly. You might be able to recall an incident that happened in December 2008 when at a press conference in Baghdad, an Iraqi journalist took off his shoes and threw them at the US President George W. Bush. In Australia, we're kind of like, who throws a shoe? But in those countries, in that culture, that was an expression of disgust and shame. John the Baptist spoke of his unworthiness relative to Jesus by saying that I am even unfit to tie his sandals. This woman doesn't dare to approach the head of Jesus. No, she's humble, unworthy, so approaches his feet. And as she does so, she's so overcome in that time that she begins to weep. She breaks down. Tears begin to flow from her eyes. Maybe it starts at a trickle, but ends in a torrent. And maybe not aware that this was going to happen for her, not prepared for this action, she realizes she doesn't have a towel and nothing to dry Jesus' feet as her tears have poured over them. And so she undoes the tie which holds her hair together, her hair, and wipes and dries his feet. Jewish women didn't untie their hair in public. To untie your hair was considered an intimate gesture, something that was only allowed in front of a husband. The Talmud, which is like a Jewish sort of document which has explanations of law and kind of social requirements and things, would say that to untie your hair in public was a divorceable offense. But she unties her hair. And after taking her hair and drying his feet, she begins to kiss them. And she breaks the vase, spills the perfume liberally over his feet and anoints them. She doesn't even feel worthy enough to anoint the proper place, his head. Who is this woman? She has no name in the text. She's just a sinful woman, an unwelcome woman. And yet, in a few powerful actions, she's demonstrated her gratitude, her heart. The perfume must have filled the air in that home on that occasion. Filled the air and provoked in the nostrils and also the minds of people. What's happening here? What's going on this occasion? This is not in the script of our meal together. I imagine the dinner guests were both shocked and outraged, almost unable to speak because of the uncertainty and for some the fury that bubbled up from within. And so it's Simon, who's the host of that meal, who speaks. He says to himself, If this man, if Jesus were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. She's a sinner. Kind of makes me smile. I don't know about you as I read that particular part when it says, he said to himself. I kind of feel like he needs someone to say that you need to get a better whispering voice. If Jesus were really a prophet, he would know she was a sinner. You know, sometimes actions speak louder than words. The woman's actions speak loudly, but here Simon's words speak volumes. See, he's more concerned with Jesus turning the prostitute away rather than recognizing her heart of thankfulness, isn't he? His words might even betray the real reason for which he invited Jesus to come. I mean, when you think about it, Jesus did not have to be much of a prophet. I mean, the people in those cities knew who the prostitute was. And here she comes and touches Jesus, approaches him. In fact, the word that it uses there for touches has kind of this sexual element to it. Surely a religious leader, Simon thinks, if that is who Jesus is, would respond differently. So how to respond if you're Jesus to this accusation, in a sense? Well, in his typical insight, he answers the thoughts of Simon by telling a simple story, a simple parable. Simon, he says to the Pharisee, I have something to say to you. Well, go ahead, teacher, Simon replied. A man loaned money to two people, 500 pieces of silver to one, 50 pieces to the other. But neither of them could repay him. So he kindly forgave them both, cancelling their debts. Who do you suppose loved him more? I mean, one man is forgiven 2 years' worth of money. Let's just call it an even 150K. And another one is forgiven 2 and a bit months. Let's call it 15. Well, Simon is trapped, isn't he? Who do you suppose loved him more? Well, if before he used his whisper voice, I suspect that now he's using his mumbles. I suppose. The Pharisee who judged Jesus, the Pharisee who judged the woman, is now judged. I mean, what's that, Simon? I can't hear you. What's that? I can't hear you. Look at this woman kneeling here. When I entered your home, you didn't offer me water to wash the dust from my feet. But she's washed them with her tears, wiped them with her hair. You didn't greet me with a kiss, but from the time I first came in, she's not stopped kissing my feet. You neglected the courtesy of olive oil to anoint my head. She has anointed my head with rare perfume. I anointed my feet with rare perfume. The contrast. Tears that are used to wash feet. Simon doesn't even offer water to drink. I mean, it's not compulsory in those environments socially, but it's still thoughtful. She's repeatedly kissed his feet. He'd offered no kiss. In their culture, a kiss wasn't mandatory, but it was acceptable. In fact, in their culture, where people kissed was a representation of their status. So you would kiss a parent, the hand. You would kiss a peer on their head, a lower class person on their hand, but she kisses his feet. She had broken this alabaster vase of perfume. And he didn't even crack open a bottle of olive oil to anoint her feet. So Jesus says, I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven. So she's shown me much love. But a person who is forgiven little shows only little love. There's always such insight, isn't there, in the little asides that you read in the text. Before Simon speaks to himself, and here Jesus has another little aside. I tell you her sins, and they are many. Now, normally we would think that that is an act, an expression of shame. But here it's almost an acknowledgement of the amount of love and forgiveness she's received. Increase forgiveness, increase love. Little sense of forgiveness, little love. In 2012, the National Academy of Sciences published a series of studies looking at how upper-class individuals behaved. It was combined with researchers at the University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Toronto. And in a series of experiments, one professor by the name of Paul Piff investigated people and how they behaved. In one experiment, they set up observers at the equivalent of a roundabout and a pedestrian crossing. You can imagine them doing that out here at the corner of Bemboka and Plymouth Road. There's the roundabout, and we've also got a pedestrian crossing. They set up observers, and the observers were told to categorize vehicles as they drove. They had 4 categories of vehicles, in a sense, ranging in sort of from the value of the vehicle. So if you're driving the 1975 Toyota Corolla, it's category 1. If you're driving, the 2023 BMW M5, it's a different category. They observed what they did. About 90% of drivers followed the law requiring them to stop for pedestrians. But they reported that people who drove luxury vehicles were 3 to 4 times more likely not to than those who drove vehicles that were worth far less. In fact, they reported that the likelihood of a person slowing down decreased by 3% for every extra $1,000 the vehicle was worth. In another experiment, people were invited to attend a seminar. And as is usual with psychology experiments, it's kind of like you think what's happening is over here, but really the real action is over here. The real experiment was about this. At the end of the session, the people in the room were told that there were bowls of lollies outside the room, which were set aside for children who were coming in for a later session. On the bowls, they had printed cards with the same details. And they were also told that they could take a lolly for themselves if they wanted to do so. The video recording revealed that wealthy people on average took twice as many lollies for themselves as people who weren't. In another experiment, people were invited to roll dice and report their scores. In this test of honesty, people making $150,000 a year cheated 4 times as much as someone who made $15,000 a year. The prize for the highest score of rolling the dice, $50. The conclusion of the experiments was that the more money you have, the more greedy you tend to be. You're more willing to throw ethics out the window to get what you want. Is it true that gratitude leads to generosity? Or is it equally true that when we take things for granted, it leads to greed? In Jesus' story, who do you identify with? Is it easy to be the nice middle-class suburban family who superficially have it all together? Find ourselves at the unacceptable behaviour of the sinner. Why don't they get their life in order? Enter these doors when you're worthy. Maybe for some of us, we've been following Jesus for so long that we've forgotten the forgiveness that we've experienced. Sin and shame feel so far distant in the past. And in fact, sometimes we almost like approach God and we say something, hey, God, you should be thankful that I'm on your team. Look at all the good things that I do. And some of the things that are wrong, well, maybe they're really not that bad. And we bring out the eyes of comparison and, I mean, I'm not as bad as that person over there. You know, this parable that Jesus tells, these events in his life speak loudly to us because we know the deep truth they speak of, don't we? What's the difference between the prostitute and the Pharisee? Well, the sin of the prostitute is public. It's raw, it's visual. It's unacceptable in a society that lifts up the religious leader. The sin of the Pharisee is far more sophisticated. It's hidden behind the cloak of respectability, acceptability. In fact, people can't even really see the sin of the Pharisee. The prostitute needs Jesus to forgive her. The Pharisee doesn't sense any need of forgiveness at all. The prostitute realizes that she is unworthy. The Pharisee thinks that he is the one who is worthy of all. Now, God's word teaches us clearly, doesn't it, that each one of us is sinners. Each one of us is separate from God. It's only the grace of God that allows us to be reconciled with him. You know, it was a scandal. It was a scandal for what the prostitute did at that meal. But it is equally as scandalous as what Jesus did with his grace. His grace that says, come. His grace that says you are welcome. His grace that says that it doesn't matter what your past is, you can be forgiven. And today, I want to remind each one of us that we are recipients of that grace. Grace that should cause us to overflow with generosity rather than take for granted. Let's pray. And I just want to leave some silence here. And I invite you just in this quietness for you to ask that question, who do you identify with? And if you identify with the prostitute, I invite you to let your heart overflow with gratefulness for what Jesus has done. To pour out your heart. To break open all that you have and to anoint him with it. But if you identify with the Pharisee, maybe you've forgotten what it is to be thankful. Maybe you don't think you're really in much need of forgiveness at all. I ask you just to briefly pray. It might be a prayer like, God, please remind me of your sin, of my sin. God, please remind me of your grace which wipes that away. God, please take away my sin of self-justification. Break my heart. For our God, we thank you that we see in Jesus the scandal of your grace. Your grace that says it doesn't matter where we come from, we can be forgiven. God, I pray that you would remind us of the extent of that sinfulness, not that we would be caught up in shame, but that our hearts would overflow in thankfulness. We thank you for the scandal of your grace, grace that we didn't deserve, and yet grace that you pour out.